Okay, this week we're looking at classical art, which is the art of the Greek and Roman eras from about the 5th century BC to 150 AD. And this was a momentous change in the history of art. What the Greeks did was sort of rewrite the book on what is art and basically set the ground plan or the roadmap for Western civilization. So just a few of the things that the Greeks were very responsible for was a huge change in art, an art that became more realistic. The anatomy of the human body came into focus. They developed philosophy in terms of the Western idea of philosophy, questioning, wondering about things and how do we know that. They developed politics in terms of democracy, that only men could vote, actually, landowning men. And they laid the groundwork for science. So a lot of the things in Western culture that define Western culture found their roots back with the Greeks. Now, Greek art can be divided roughly into three stages. The dates, like all dates in art history, you don't need to be fanatical about. You just need to know the general time that they happened. And so the archaic is the early phase of Greek art. The classical was considered by many scholars their high point, and the Hellenistic was the decline. Now, this is a value judgment that not everybody shares. I certainly don't. I think the Hellenistic is a very fascinating stage of Greek art. But it's a common pattern of birth, growth, and decay that many historians like to adhere to, but I'll leave that up to you. So the earliest Greek statues that we have, not the earliest, but the earliest that we associate with modern Greece, classical Greece, was something known as the Kouros. Now these statues were very similar to what we saw in Egypt, the sort of stiff figures with one foot leaning forward, hands by the side, and a very frontal look. And these sculptures also differed significantly from the Egyptians. Let me show you another view right here. You can see we have the sort of rudiments of anatomy. Probably the most striking feature of these is that they're actually naked. Most art prior to the Greeks, and I say that in a qualified sense, not all art, was clothed or with some sort of clothing draping the genitals and stuff like that. But the Greeks were really the first to start exploiting the naked body in full. Now if you look closely, you see the beginnings of more and more detail. Look at the kneecaps, for example, the folds of the skin, the patella, the kneecap, and then we get the hips and the muscles, the abdomen, the rib cage. All of these things are beginning to be defined, but still a very stiff, unhuman-like figure, especially from the side, looks very flat. There were female chorai, and they're known as the chorae. And one thing we'll notice about the females is that they have the same sort of smiley blank face, arms down to the side. Oh, this one's reaching out with one of her arms. But probably the most striking feature is the women are by and large always clothed. This is something we'll see in a lot of Greek art. For Greek society, the male body, the athletic young male body, was considered an ideal of beauty, and therefore an ideal of truth and something to aspire to. And in Greek society, it really was about men. Men were much higher on the totem pole than women, and so, for instance, desire or love between two men was seen as a higher form of love than love between a man and a woman. One way of characterizing the classical Greece, the era of classical Greece, is that it was a homosexual society. Now that's not entirely true, because they weren't homosexual in the sense that we understand the word homosexual, two men being in love and having a life together. In Greek society, every man of status and power had to have a wife because he had to have an heir. But he also took a small, young male lover, and that was considered sort of standard fare, because the male body and the male beauty and the male ideal was seen as perfect and ideal, and the woman was very much second rate in Grecian culture. So we go back and we look at the Egyptians. We've seen this one before. You notice the similar qualities we just saw in the early Greeks, but this is quite a bit earlier. But it's that rigid, hands at the side, blank stare, looking forward. But you'll notice in this that there's the stone in between the statues right here and the stone in between the arms is all still intact. These statues are meant to be looked at from the front. When we go back to the Greeks, we see that the stone between has been removed. It's been cut out, and these statues are really meant to go around and see the back. Um, at around 480 BC, we begin to get a huge change in Greek art. No longer do we have that stiff sort of figure. We begin to get a much more lifelike figure, and the Critias boy is considered the high point of that sort of movement, that sort of change. And what we see here is a much more defined anatomy with the rib cage, the shoulders, collarbones. We get a much more naturalistic knee and shin bone, as well as the hips. And so we have a high degree of naturalism. And one thing that separated the Greeks from previous cultures was their emphasis on the human form, the human body, but also human emotions, human desires, human needs. And the Greek gods, if you think of the Greek gods of Zeus and Mars and Athena and Venus, they were all human-like. Not only did they look like humans, but they acted like humans with all their virtues and all their vices. They would fall in love, they would be deceptive, they would steal, they would rape, they would pillage. Very, very human type gods. Now this classical age was ushered in by the Critias boy, and probably the thing that defines it the most was that in Greek art there was a combination of realism and idealism. Now this was a very contentious issue for the Greeks. Realism is the idea of just looking like something real, and the Greek word for mimesis is the word that they use. Mimesis is the root of our word to mimic or to imitate. And so realism was really about copying. Now copying was, in some parts of Greek culture, a little bit suspect, and that's largely to do with the influence of Plato. So we look here, this is a painting, a much later painting, but it's a painting that depicts Plato here on the left and Aristotle here on the right. And these are the two main pillars of Greek conceptual thinking culture. Plato was very distrustful of artists. He felt that artists were making copies of things. They were imitating things. So they were peddling in illusion. And for someone who was very much attached to the idea of truth, that playing with illusion was from Plato's point of view at least, considered very, very dangerous in terms of corrupting the youth. In Plato's world, the real world is a world of forms, an ideal world of the perfect table, the perfect house, the perfect wife, the perfect chin, the perfect everything. Everything had its ideal form. And for Plato, the physical world, the world we live in, is a copy of that, but an imperfect copy because it's subject to decay, and vice and moral corruption. And so anybody who copied something that was in the world, like an artist would paint or a sculptor would sculpt, was considered making a copy of a copy. So he was twice removed from truth. So in his ideal world, in a book called The Republic, which is an ideal society, the artists were banished. They were considered dangerous. This gentleman over here, Aristotle, had a very different view. He felt that copying was how we learned, and by imitating life, we would learn about life. And so for Aristotle, something like theater and drama, which is very popular in ancient Greece, when people died or fell in love, they didn't really die, they didn't really fall in love, and everybody knew that. It was a copy, it was an imitation of life and an imitation of emotions and ideas. And for Aristotle, that suspension of disbelief and entering into the drama was how we learned about being a human being and how we learned about emotions and honor and duty and things like that. And so for Aristotle, artists were a very, very positive force. But these were two contradictory elements. So what the Greeks did was they actually merged those two concepts together. And so here's a good example. It's called the Doryphoros, which is the spear bearer. And if you look at it, we have a huge development in terms of realism. We look at the muscles across the chest, and then we had a detail, there's sort of veins on the arms and tendons. We come back to the muscles again on the kneecaps and the hips and the rib cage and the different sorts of muscles on the shoulders. Highly, highly developed level of realism. But if you actually think about it, nobody in Greece looked like this. This is the perfect merging, and that's what classical art really sort of represents. What looks real but is actually ideal. So for someone like Polykleitos the artist, he would take the perfect kneecap, the perfect thigh, the perfect hand, the perfect head, and by perfect I mean proportions. How long is it compared to the body? How wide is it? What is the expression? And if you look at the body, you'll notice that one half of the body, the left side, is at rest. The arms hanging down, the legs straight. The other half of the body is in motion. The knees bent and the arm is bent and actually holding a spear originally. And so classical art was this combination of opposites, this paradoxical union, not only of the real and the ideal, but the active and the passive, all rolled up into one. And so we need to remember that when we look at this art, nobody actually looked like this. If you're wondering what this little piece is here, it's a device often used by sculptors to keep the stone stable. By putting a little bit of stone in between the hand and the body, it stops the arm from breaking off and snapping. Also, this pose that he's in is a very famous pose, one you're going to have to learn the name of. It's called contrapposto, which means counterpoise. And what it is he shifted the weight of his body onto one leg. So all the weight is on this leg. We know that because it's straight and this leg's bent and the foot's lifted. But also we get an angle of the hips right here, and the shoulders stay pretty much straight. So instead of being parallel and horizontal, things begin to angle. And what that does is it creates a sense of life. Now if you think about it, this is just a chunk of marble. It doesn't have weight that can go onto one leg. But by creating this pose, Greek artists were able to bring a sense of, infuse a sense of life into their sculptures, as if there really was an internal center of gravity, and as if the statue actually could shift all its weight onto one leg. So contrapposto became a very, very popular, widely used technique in sculpture. Another ideal perfect. Now this is a Roman copy. Many of the works we have by the Greek artists are actually Roman copies. The Romans greatly admired the Greeks and imitated and copied them lavishly. And again, this is an ideal face. So for the ancient Greeks, this is the perfect distance between the eyes, perfect length of the nose, the perfect lips, etc., etc. The discus thrower, again, this is a very popular image if you're aware of Greek art. The interesting thing about this is that no discus player or thrower, ever gets into this position. This is a very unnatural position for the sport. The reason he's in this position is to show off the body. So we're able to see the arm going up, the arm going down, the leg forward, the leg backward, all the muscles in the body and the hips and the thigh, the veins running down the arms. And so it was really just a position for display so the artist could show off their abilities. The Riachi bronzes are two of the most famous sculptures in the Greek world, not only for what they depict. Again, we have the ideal body, again in contrapposto, relaxed and bent. The hips, you can see, are at an angle here. But more importantly, these are cast in bronze. So as a feat of bronze casting, they're absolutely brilliant and far beyond anything that we've seen in other cultures. When we take a close look at the face, we can see that the eyes were done with various pieces of bone and ivory, and in the middle here they would have had precious stones and jewels. You can even see the eyelashes beginning to appear over the eye right here. Different types of metal were used as inlay. I'm not sure exactly what the teeth were. They might have been either a piece of metal or bone. But one thing we have to remember when we look at these statues, and not so much the bronze ones, is that the Greeks were also aiming for realism in terms of painting. So when we see Greek statues, we often see things like this: white marble or bronze. But the reality was, in the Greek world, it looked like this. Everything in Greece was painted. And so the image we have of ancient Greece as these white stone buildings against a blue sky with white statues with missing limbs against a blue sky is a very illusory. Ancient Egypt probably looked a lot more like modern-day India or Pakistan, full of color, full of bazaars. We look at this face, the eyes, the pupils, the reflections in the eyes, and we know this because, if I go back, all the little samples of paint that they were able to sort of detect, scientists, and find on these statues, and so they recreated these images. And even something like this, the Augustus statue, if we were to recreate it, and they have, would have looked something like this. Not quite sure why they didn't do the skin a different color, but like maybe they didn't have the pigments for that. But you can see these were very different objects. Here's an early Kore, and you can see her outfit and all the patterning, which without the paint would just be a blank piece of marble or sandstone, be just the plain color. And even the temples, we look at the Parthenon, this would have been painted, and so this is another reconstruction of the top of the Parthenon and what it would have looked like. I just want to go back, to the Parthenon here. I'll just tell you a little bit about Greek architecture. Greek architecture was famous for its post and lintel construction, which was nothing new. And what that means is these are the posts, things that are vertical, and lintels are things that lay across. So it's a sort of vertical, horizontal structure. Something the Egyptians did and many, many cultures did, very, very common. But what the Greeks did was they developed it to a fine art. So for example, they looked at these large buildings and they realized that when you have a series of columns, especially on a long side, if you made them all the same height, it would create the illusion that it was sagging in the middle. So what the Greeks actually did is when they come to the middle, the columns start to get taller and taller and then get smaller and smaller towards the end. What that does is it creates the illusion of being straight. Another thing they did was the columns in the middle are all the same width, but the columns on the outside, because they would have had a bright sky behind them, would have appeared thinner because of the brightness of the light. So what the Greeks did was they made their columns on the corners thicker than the columns on the inside, so that they all appeared to be the same size. So lots of very interesting engineering developments were put into the Greek buildings, and all this again had to do with the whole idea of perfection. Regardless of something being perfect, more importantly, it has to look perfect. And another reconstruction of another Greek temple. We can see again how colorful it was. Everything was embellished with color. If we look at paintings, we don't have a lot of Greek paintings. Paint didn't really survive the ravages of time. We do have it in Egyptian art, for example, because a lot of these paintings were in tombs or enclosed underground or in buildings. But we do have some reconstructions of Greek art, so I just want to start by comparing this Egyptian painting, which, if we recall, everything's two-dimensional, everything's flat. The little people here are not little people. It's about status. The more important you are, the bigger you are. It's called hierarchic scaling. And so these were probably the wives, the daughters, and the servants. And we compare that to this painting, which is a Roman painting, but based on a Greek original. We see the incredible level of realism in the work, the details of the lights and the shadows. We can see the anatomy underneath the clothing here. Various animals and birds. We have overlapping people in the back, cast shadows on the wall, and little details like this shadow right here from his foot, and also these cast shadows from the objects below. This was a high degree of realism attained in the painting, and this was really what distinguished the Greeks artistically from any other culture, was their degree of realism that they were able to do. Now, scholarship has lots of different opinions on this, and there's a lot of information that the Greeks really weren't the first to do this, that it might have come from a northern Indian civilization known as Harappan civilization, or various other Persian civilizations that are currently being dug up. And so the history of Greek art, just like the history of Paleolithic art, is still a huge question. Were they the first to do it, or were they influenced by northern India and Persia in these developments? And at the current time, we're really not sure exactly how that lineage connects. So we often attribute this high degree of realism to the Greeks, but that might change any time in the future. To show you how influential realism was in Greek society, I'll tell you the story about Zeuxis and Parrhasius. These were two artists, two painters that both claimed to be the greatest painter. And so after countless squabbles and fights, they decided to have a competition. And they decided to let the public be the decider. And so each of them went and painted a picture. And they were going to show this picture publicly. So what happened was Zeuxis went first, and he painted a picture. And they met at on a certain date in a certain place, and the huge crowd was outside. And Zeus showed his picture, and it was stuck on a wall. And the crowd saw it, and obviously this isn't it, but this is probably something what it looked like. It was, by descriptions, a bowl of fruit with grapes and various other fruits in it. And when the crowd saw it, they were amazed by its realism, and they cheered emphatically. And Zeus was feeling rather smug, like he's going to win this. And then he asked the crowd to calm down, just be quiet, and just look at the painting for a little while. And what happened was, while they were looking, a bird flew down, thinking that the fruit was real, went to snag a little piece of a grape and hit the wall and died and fell to the ground. And the crowd went wild, and they were rapturous, and Zeus was puffing his chest. He's certainly, how do you beat that? You fooled nature. And so he turned to Parrhasius and he said, now it's your turn. And Parrhasius said, well, my painting's over there. It's behind the curtain next to you. So Zeus turned around, saw the curtain, and reached out to grab the curtain, which turned out to be a painted wall. So you can imagine the crowd went wild. This guy can fool nature, but this guy can fool this guy. Well, Parrhasius wins the day. So you can see this story exemplifies the sort of competitive nature of realism in Greek society, and that desire to really sort of trick and fool the eye. The final stage of Greek art is often referred to as Hellenistic, which means Greek-like, and it's often dated from the death of Alexander the Great to the Roman conquest. And this was a period, like I said, many scholars felt was a period of decline. The reality is it's just a different period. Things happen. And here's an iconic representation. So the first thing we notice about this compared to classical art is that this is just full of movement and emotion. So we've got this priest named Laocoon, and he's fighting with these serpents, and these are his two sons, and they're all tied up and twisted and struggling. And so we've lost that sort of classical composure of just standing very calm, and half the body's in motion and half the body's still. And if you remember the faces on the classical statues, they were very, very calm, very poised, but they weren't lazy or sleepy or tired or distracted. They were very attentive. They were very, they held themselves together well. When we look at Laocoon and his sons, they're in agony, they're writhing, they're screaming. And if you look at their bodies, their exaggerated muscles are bulging and straining. And this is typical of Hellenistic art. Hellenistic art is full of emotion, it's full of drama, it's full of movement. Technical level far surpasses the classical. You look at all the holes and all the gaps in the space between these. This is quite a feat sculpturally to be able to do. But notice also the size of the figures. What we have again, coming back into Greek art, is hierarchic scaling. Laocoon is the father, he's bigger, and his two sons are smaller. And the story here was Laocoon was in Troy, and remember the Helen of Troy and the Battle of Troy, and he knew that the horse, the Trojan horse, that was being delivered was a trick. And he was about to tell everybody inside the city of Troy that this was a trick and don't fall for it. And Minerva, the goddess who wanted for him to be quiet to ensure that the Trojan horse would be a success, sent serpents down, and the serpents strangled and killed him and his sons before they could say anything. The Venus de Milo, very, very famous Venus. You'll be curious to note that this is actually a Hellenistic sculpture. It looks very classical, very poised, very balanced. Look at the expression. But there's another element to Hellenism which is really hard for us to see, and there's a sensuality to the body, to the skin, a sort of fleshiness, which also is characteristic of the Hellenistic era. Very Hellenistic sculpture. Look at the drama, look at the movement, look at the emotion. And also little people, children, old people, all of these things began to be made into sculpture. A huge departure from the classical realm where you only really focused on perfection, perfect bodies, perfect people, perfect proportions. So the Hellenistic was much more varied, much more diverse, much more interesting. Now, when we come to the Romans, we get two things happening. one, we got an enormous admiration for the Greeks. And so people in Roman society of high status really just imitated the Greeks. They copied their art, their drama, their music. They took their whole gods and goddesses, lock, stock, and barrel, and just shifted them to Rome and changed their names a bit. The other thing about the Romans was that they were very, very practical people. They were less interested in art in terms of creating great aesthetic sculptures. They're more interested in politics and civil engineering, the law, legal issues, domination, conquest, very much down to earth, plumbing, hot water systems through the buildings. And so they lacked the idealism of the Greeks. And so this is a very typical portrait, a very typical Roman portrait. And you look at all the wrinkles and the jowls and the sunken cheeks, the lines on the forehead. No self-respecting Greek classical sculptor would have ever done something like this. So it's very much a Roman high level of absolute realism. And this probably grew out of their practice of ancestor worship, where when somebody died, a plaster cast of their face would be made, and that cast would then turn into a bust that would go onto an altar or mantle or some sort of table in the house. And you can imagine when you pour plaster on somebody's face, it being liquid, it just goes into every crevice, nook, and cranny. It doesn't really lie. It records the face exactly. So that might be one of the main reasons Roman sculpture became so realistic. And another example. You see the wrinkles on the side and the bones and the sunken cheeks and the kind of expressive sort of mouth. Again, remember these were also painted, so they don't look anything like this. This Greek influence and Roman inheritance became a huge influence throughout history. We call it the classical or neoclassical influence. And you can only, one only has to go to look at Washington, D.C. to see this kind of influence. So we look at the Lincoln Memorial. What we have again are these Greek columns. It's a post and a lintel system. The types of columns you'll read in your book, the capitals, which are the top here, have a particular order or style or type. These are Doric, which means early, and they're very kind of just plain. Ionic are those curly cues that look like shells, and Corinthian ones are very, very floral and highly decorative. But we look at this, it's a white building, it's very, very Greek, Lincoln Memorial. And even statues of George Washington, you know, marble, contrapposto stance. And then look at this right here, it's meant to sort of imitate a Greek column. Now, this craze for classicism did get a little carried away, did get carried to extremes, and here is a statue of George Washington in a toga. Yep, this statue was put out in front of the Capitol building and finally had to be removed because people just, they couldn't take it anymore. This is George Washington, he's got his sandals on, he's got his toga, he's got the body of a 25-year-old and the face of a 55-year-old, and it just was too bizarre and too unusual. So right now it's in the Smithsonian Institute. Another thing about Greek beauty was that they felt that their sense of beauty was divine in the sense that it was part of the fabric of the world. And so they came up with this idea of the golden section, which is basically if you were to take a square and divide it into two halves, A and B, the Greeks felt there's a perfect place to divide it, and that's right here. It's not in the middle, it's not too far to the side, it's roughly about 2/3 from one side and 1/3 from the other side. And the Greeks felt that the relationship of A to B was the same as the relationship of B to the whole. So it had this sort of internal and external proportional balance. And this line falls in a place right here. The ratio is like 0.61104. It goes on and on and on forever. So they felt that this was an ideal division, and so many of their buildings are built like this. If you remember the Parthenon, the front was this big, but the side was this big. We go here, this golden section has been replicated and found to exist in nature in a great many forms. Here is a great big rectangle, there's a division. Then we took the small rectangle and divided it, we'd go there. Take the small rectangle and divide it, and then we go here, take the rectangle, divide it, and if you connect all the intersections, we get this spiral form. Okay, sorry, go back to that. And many scientists today find this pattern reproduced in all sorts of things from snail shells, sunflower seeds, ferns, you name it. But it's quite debatable how accurate it was, but the Greeks at least felt it was an ideal, divine, sort of perfect system. And then finally, I just want to end this brief introduction with an example of a piece of sculpture by a British sculptor named Mark Quinn. He had to he was chosen to exhibit and create work in response to a museum called the Victoria and Albert Museum in England. And what he decided to do was choose the cast room, and the cast room had all the casts of Greek and Roman art that artists for centuries would copy and draw from. And these were all the typical white statues with limbs missing. And what Mark Quinn decided to do was cast real people who had missing limbs. And so this is Jamie Gillespie, and Mark Quinn cast him in white plaster and then exhibited him next to all these Greek and Roman statues. And so it was a very interesting contradiction and paradox between the classical ideals of beauty, and right next to them are people that are considered deformed or lacking or missing. The opposite of the classical golden section ideal of beauty. And yet, to the eye, they were almost indistinguishable. They were people standing with no limbs, in white, and naked. So it was a very interesting exhibition, and it just goes to show that many artists today are still dealing with this classical tradition and commenting on it. Around 300 AD, we have the decline of the Roman Empire. Notice not a lot of Roman stuff in this short introduction. Your book and the readings will have a lot more of that. But when we come to the decline of the Roman Empire, we come to the rise of Christianity, and that'll take us into week 4.